Flight crew force Barron Trump to leave first class. Minutes later, they're escorted off the plane by security. An ordinary flight takes an extraordinary turn when a young man quietly settles into his first-class seat. At first, nothing seems out of the ordinary until the flight crew steps in, their actions sparking tension, whispers and questions. But what they didn't know about this passenger would lead to a dramatic confrontation that no one on board could have predicted. What happened next left the crew stunned, the passengers in disbelief, and the airline scrambling to respond. Who was this man, and why did his presence ignite such chaos? Stay with us as we unravel a story of prejudice, power, and a reckoning that shook the skies. The terminal was buzzing with the familiar chaos of holiday travel. Business people with their sleek roller bags, families juggling toddlers and suitcases, and lone travelers, their faces buried in phones, all converged at Gate 17. Among the crowd, unnoticed by most, was Barron Trump. He stood taller than many, his broad shoulders draped in a simple, well-fitted sweater and dark jeans. His unassuming outfit blended into the sea of passengers, but his quiet confidence gave him an air of subtle command. Barron had always preferred to travel without fanfare. Growing up in the public eye had taught him that invisibility was a luxury. This time, traveling alone, he had hoped for a quiet flight. Just a few hours of solitude in the first-class cabin, reading a novel his mother had recommended. But life, as he knew too well, rarely went according to plan. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who barely glanced at him before scanning it with a mechanical beep. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone polite but distracted. Barron nodded, offering a small smile, and stepped onto the jet bridge, his carry-on bag rolling silently behind him. The first-class cabin was pristine, the soft hum of air conditioning blending with the muted voices of passengers settling in. Barron slid into his seat by the window and stowed his bag beneath the seat in front of him. He leaned back, running a hand through his thick blonde hair, and exhaled. The view of the tarmac outside was a welcome change from the relentless chaos of the terminal. A flight attendant approached, her name tag gleaming. Clara. She was in her mid-30s, her perfectly tailored uniform complemented by a sharp, rehearsed smile. At first, she seemed friendly, offering Barron a pre-flight beverage. But the moment she scanned his seat assignment, her demeanor shifted imperceptibly. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, her tone laced with thinly veiled skepticism. Barron blinked, surprised. "Of course." He retrieved the neatly folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Clara glanced at it, then back at him, her eyebrows knitting together. "You're in first class?" she asked, the question carrying a note of incredulity. "Yes," Barron replied calmly, his tone steady but firm. "Is there a problem?" Her lips pressed into a tight line as she studied him, her eyes lingering on his casual clothes and youthful face. "No problem," she said curtly, handing back the pass. But as she walked away, Barron could feel her judgment lingering in the air like a faint, unpleasant smell. The murmurs began shortly after. Barron noticed the glances from the flight crew, the whispers exchanged just out of earshot. Clara returned, accompanied by another attendant, a man whose name tag read David. This time, there was no pretense of friendliness. "Sir," David began, his voice firm but laced with condescension, "are you sure you're in the right seat? First class is reserved for premium passengers." Barron's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I'm certain," he said, pulling out his boarding pass again. "It's clearly marked, Seat 2A, First Class." David took the pass, scrutinizing it as if it were a counterfeit bill. He handed it back reluctantly, his frown deepening. "I'll have to verify this," he muttered before walking away, leaving Clara behind to stand watch. The exchange did not go unnoticed. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Barron and the flight crew. Some whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued. Others avoided looking altogether, unwilling to get involved. Barron remained seated, his expression calm, but his mind racing. He was no stranger to unwarranted scrutiny, but something about the situation felt different. There was no mistaking the thinly veiled disdain in their voices, the way Clara and David looked at him as though he didn't belong. Minutes later, David returned, his face set in a mask of authority. "Mr. Trump, I'm going to have to ask you to vacate this seat. There's been a misunderstanding." Barron's patience, though vast, had limits. He rose slowly, his imposing height drawing attention from the surrounding passengers. "There's no misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet edge. "This is my seat. I paid for it, and I'm staying." David stiffened, clearly not expecting resistance. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to involve airport security." Barron stared at him, his piercing blue eyes unwavering. "Do what you have to do," he said simply, sinking back into his seat. The tension in the cabin was palpable as David and Clara retreated, their whispers now frantic. Barron gazed out the window, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He knew what was coming. They didn't. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the tarmac. Inside, the drama was only beginning to unfold. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The once serene first-class section now buzzed with tension, the low hum of whispers and murmurs forming an undercurrent of unease. Barron Trump remained in his seat, outwardly calm, his hands resting on the armrests. But inside, a quiet storm brewed. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. Years of living under public scrutiny had taught him to suppress such emotions. Instead, he observed, studied the situation like a chessboard, considering his next move. The flight crew's behavior was telling. Clara, the attendant who had first approached him, was now speaking animatedly with David near the galley. Their glances toward him were furtive but unmistakable. Minutes passed. Then David and Clara returned, this time flanked by a third crew member, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority. Her name tag read Margaret, and her expression was resolute. She was the lead flight attendant, Barron surmised, the one they'd brought in to resolve the problem. "Mr. Trump," Margaret began, her tone firm but not overtly hostile, "we've reviewed the situation, and it appears there's been some confusion with your seat assignment." Barron leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he regarded her. "Confusion?" he repeated, his voice measured. "I don't see how. My ticket is valid, and I've presented it twice." Margaret's lips thinned. "While that may be the case, we've received reports that your presence in first class is making other passengers uncomfortable. We must prioritize the comfort and safety of all our guests." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Barron tilted his head, his gaze sharpening. "And what exactly about my presence is making them uncomfortable?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Margaret hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "It's standard protocol," she said finally. "We have the discretion to reassign seats if necessary." Barron scanned the cabin. The other first-class passengers avoided his gaze, suddenly engrossed in their screens or magazines. A few shifted uncomfortably in their plush seats, their guilt manifesting in their refusal to engage. One older man near the aisle, wearing an expensive suit, glanced at Barron briefly before looking away, his jaw tightening. It was a silence Barron knew well, the kind born of complicity, where people chose the path of least resistance rather than standing up for what was right. He sighed inwardly, his patience thinning. "I'll ask again," Barron said, his voice low but commanding. "What about my presence is making people uncomfortable?" Margaret's composure faltered. She glanced at David and Clara, who looked anywhere but at Barron. "Sir, I don't believe this is the place to discuss specifics," she said, regaining her professional tone. "If you'd like, we can continue this conversation off the plane." Barron opened his mouth to respond, but a new development cut him off. From the corner of his eye, he saw two uniformed airport security officers boarding the plane. Their presence sent ripples through the cabin, passengers shifting in their seats and exchanging uneasy glances. The officers approached, their expressions neutral but purposeful. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a name tag reading Officer Martinez, spoke first. "Is there a problem here?" Margaret turned to them, her relief evident. "Yes, officers. This passenger is refusing to comply with our seating protocols and has become disruptive." Barron raised an eyebrow at the word disruptive. He had barely raised his voice, let alone caused a disturbance. But the accusation wasn't meant to be truthful. It was meant to justify their actions. "Officers," Barron said, his tone polite but firm, "there seems to be a misunderstanding. My ticket is valid, and I've been asked to leave my assigned seat without a legitimate reason. I'd appreciate it if this could be resolved fairly." Martinez glanced at Barron, then at Margaret. His expression betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Let me see the ticket," he said, extending a hand. Barron handed over the paper, his movements slow and deliberate. The officer studied it, his brow furrowing. "It's valid," he said after a moment, handing it back. Margaret stiffened. "It's not about the ticket, officer. It's about the comfort of our passengers." Martinez's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly is the issue with his presence?" Margaret hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. The other passengers remained silent, their complicity growing heavier with each passing second. Barron exhaled slowly, then stood, his imposing height drawing attention. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried an undeniable authority. "You're making a mistake," he said, his gaze fixed on Margaret. "I suggest you think carefully about your next move." Margaret's eyes darted between Barron and the officers. She seemed to weigh her options, her pride warring with the nagging doubt that she might be in over her head. Finally, she gestured toward the security officers. "Remove him from the cabin," she said, her voice clipped. The officers hesitated, but complied. One of them placed a hand on Barron's arm, a gesture more symbolic than forceful. Barron didn't resist. Instead, he allowed himself to be led down the aisle, his steps measured and unhurried. As he passed the other passengers, he felt their stares, some curious, others sympathetic, and a few openly judgmental. He stopped at the divider between first class and economy, turning back to face the crew. His expression was unreadable, but his words carried a quiet promise. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he turned and walked into the economy section, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. The first-class cabin remained eerily quiet. Margaret, Clara, and David exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence replaced by unease. Somewhere, deep in their subconscious, they knew this wasn't over. But for now, they were content to believe they had won. They were wrong. Barron Trump sat silently in the cramped economy seat, a stark contrast to the luxurious space he had rightfully claimed moments earlier. His long legs barely fit in the confined space, and the armrests pressed uncomfortably against his sides. Yet his posture remained impeccable, his back straight, his chin held high, and his expression unreadable. Around him, murmurs buzzed like static. Passengers whispered furtively, casting sideways glances at him, their curiosity piqued, but their courage to engage non-existent. He pulled out his phone, not to text or call, but to calmly scroll through the photos of his family, a grounding exercise he had used for years. A picture of him at a White House Christmas party with his mother, Melania, caught his eye. The tree had been enormous, adorned with shimmering lights and ornaments, its presence both comforting and intimidating. He remembered his mother's words that night. "Strength isn't in loud declarations, it's in quiet dignity." Her advice resonated now, as it often did, urging him to stay composed. Back in the first-class cabin, the unease was palpable. Margaret paced the aisle, her polished heels clicking against the carpeted floor. Clara and David avoided eye contact, their earlier smugness replaced by a creeping sense of doubt. Passengers exchanged hushed conversations, their words punctuated by nervous glances toward the now vacant Seat 2A. "Did you hear what he said?" whispered a woman in a crisp business suit. He told them they'd regret it. "What if he's someone important?" murmured her seatmate, his voice tinged with apprehension. "He doesn't look like just anyone." Margaret caught snippets of these conversations, her chest tightening with anxiety. She had dismissed Barron as an entitled young man trying to game the system, but now the quiet confidence in his demeanor replayed in her mind like a warning she had ignored. The tension came to a head when two new figures boarded the plane, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. They were higher-ranking airport security officers, flanked by a stern-looking woman in a tailored black suit. The insignia on her lapel identified her as Chief of Airport Operations. Passengers straightened in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The woman's heels clicked against the floor with an authority that silenced the whispers as she made her way toward the flight crew. Margaret froze, her face draining of color. The woman stopped in front of Margaret, her sharp eyes locking onto her. "I'm Chief Landry, head of airport operations," she said in a clipped tone. "I've been informed of an incident involving a passenger. I'd like an explanation, now." Margaret faltered, the weight of Landry's gaze pressing down on her. "It was a misunderstanding," she stammered. "The passenger in question didn't appear to belong in first class. We were ensuring protocols were followed." Landry's expression didn't change. "And did this protocol involve humiliating a paying passenger in front of the entire cabin?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off by Landry's sharp tone. "Do you even know who that passenger is?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Margaret's silence spoke volumes. Landry didn't wait for an answer. She gestured toward the economy cabin where Barron sat, his tall frame impossible to miss even in the crowded space. "That passenger," she said, her voice loud enough to carry, "is Barron Trump, son of the President of the United States." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks to get a better look at Barron, their earlier indifference replaced by shock and disbelief. The murmurs grew louder, a chaotic symphony of guilt, curiosity, and realization. Margaret's knees felt weak. She gripped the back of a seat to steady herself. Clara and David exchanged panicked glances, their faces pale. I didn't know," Margaret stammered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't bother to know," Landry snapped. "Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, regardless of who they are. But in this case, you didn't just disrespect a passenger, you disrespected the President's family." Landry turned on her heel and walked to the economy cabin, her presence parting the sea of passengers. She stopped in front of Barron, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice firm but respectful, "on behalf of the airline and the airport, I'd like to extend my sincerest apologies. Please allow me to escort you back to your seat in first class." Barron looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't immediately respond, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then, finally, he stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He towered over Landry, his calm composure making the officers and crew feel even smaller. "I appreciate the apology," he said quietly, "but an apology means little without accountability." Landry nodded, her respect for the young man growing. "I assure you, there will be accountability." As Barron made his way back to first class, escorted by Landry, the whispers reached a fever pitch. Passengers who had previously dismissed him as an ordinary traveler now looked at him with a mix of awe and regret. Margaret, Clara, and David stood at the front of the cabin, their expressions a mixture of dread and resignation. Landry turned to them, her voice cold and unyielding. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty. Security will escort you off the plane." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Landry silenced her with a raised hand. "Save your explanations. This airline has no room for prejudice or arrogance." As the disgraced crew was led off the plane, a ripple of satisfaction coursed through the passengers. Justice had been served, and it was swift. Barron settled back into his original seat, the soft leather a stark contrast to the cramped economy chair he had endured. He gazed out the window, the golden hues of the setting sun painting the tarmac below. Around him, the first-class cabin was silent, the passengers too stunned to speak. They had witnessed not just the power of authority, but the quiet strength of a young man who refused to be diminished. Barron leaned back, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. His mother's words echoed in his mind once more. Strength isn't in loud declarations, it's in quiet dignity, and dignity, he knew, was a strength that could move mountains. The plane had taken off, but the turbulence in the cabin wasn't from the air outside. It was the emotional and psychological aftermath of what had just unfolded. The first-class section was unusually silent, an unspoken tension lingering like a shadow over the passengers. The disgraceful exit of the flight crew had been a spectacle none of them would soon forget, and now all eyes were on Barron Trump. Barron sat in seat 2A, his posture relaxed but his expression guarded. He was used to being the focus of attention, but this time it wasn't the calculated scrutiny of the media or the rehearsed charm of political circles. This was raw, unfiltered judgment, layered with a mix of guilt and curiosity. He could feel their stares, the weight of their regret palpable, though none dared approach him. He reached into the side pocket of his carry-on and retrieved a leather-bound journal. The worn edges and gold lettering hinted at frequent use. Flipping to a blank page, he began to write, his pen gliding across the paper with a calm deliberation that belied the chaos around him. It was a habit he'd developed during his teenage years, a way to process the unique challenges of his life. As his pen moved, his thoughts flowed. Strength is not in the position you hold, but in how you respond when it's challenged. The silence was finally broken by a woman seated across the aisle. She was in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer. Her face was flushed with embarrassment as she hesitated, clutching her champagne glass. "Excuse me, Mr. Trump," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up earlier. It was wrong, what they did to you, and wrong of us to stay silent." Barron looked up from his journal, his blue eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity. He studied her for a moment before offering a small, polite nod. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone devoid of resentment. Encouraged by his response, the woman continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "It wasn't just unfair, it was humiliating, and you handled it with such grace. I don't think many of us would have done the same." Her words hung in the air, a confession that seemed to resonate with the other passengers. A few shifted in their seats, their guilt mirrored in their uneasy movements. Barron could see it in their faces, the dawning realization that their silence had been complicity. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the captain made an announcement, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend my sincerest apologies for the earlier incident. We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Thank you for your understanding." The announcement was met with murmurs of agreement, but the atmosphere remained heavy. Barron set his pen down, his thoughts momentarily interrupted. It was a well-rehearsed apology, likely crafted by the airline's legal team, but he recognized its symbolic significance. Sometimes the act of acknowledging wrongdoing was the first step toward change. The woman who had apologized earlier remained visibly unsettled. Finally, she leaned forward again, her voice low but earnest. "May I ask you something, Mr. Trump?" Barron turned to her, his expression encouraging but neutral. "Of course. How do you stay so composed? After everything they said, everything they did, I don't know if I could have kept my cool." He thought for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "It's not always easy," he admitted, his voice thoughtful. "But I've learned that anger rarely solves anything. It's better to channel it into something constructive." The woman nodded, her respect for him deepening. That's wise. I think we all could learn from that. Barron smiled faintly, his gaze returning to her. Wisdom often comes from experience, and unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've been in a situation like this. The ripple effect of the conversation was unmistakable. Other passengers, emboldened by the woman's apology, began to murmur among themselves, their words laced with guilt and regret. A man seated a row behind Barron leaned forward, his face earnest. "I didn't know who you were," he admitted, "but that shouldn't have mattered. I should have said something. I should have done more." Barron turned slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "What matters now," he said gently, "is that you recognize it. Silence allows injustice to thrive. Next time, don't stay silent." The man nodded, his expression contemplative. "You're right. I won't." As the hours passed, the tension in the cabin eased, replaced by a newfound respect for the young man who had turned humiliation into a lesson. Unbeknownst to Barron, the incident had already begun to ripple beyond the confines of the plane. In the airport's command center, Chief Landry was drafting a detailed report of the incident, her sharp penmanship reflecting her determination. The airline's CEO had been alerted, and swift measures were already in motion to address the crew's actions. Media inquiries were pouring in, and though Barron's identity had yet to be publicly revealed, the story was gaining traction. For now, though, Barron remained blissfully unaware of the growing storm. He returned to his journal, the rhythmic scratch of his pen, a soothing contrast to the muffled voices around him. Each word he wrote carried the weight of his reflection, not just on the events of the day, but on the broader lessons they underscored. Prejudice isn't just about those who act, it's about those who watch and do nothing. Silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity, he wrote, his strokes firm and deliberate. Barron glanced out the window once more, the darkening sky a reminder of the world's vastness and its endless potential for change. He knew the incident wasn't just a personal affront, it was a microcosm of the deeper systemic issues society still grappled with. And though he hadn't sought to become a symbol of that fight, he recognized the power of his position to make a difference. As the plane continued its journey, Barron prepared himself for what lay ahead. This was more than a flight. It was the beginning of a story that would reverberate far beyond the clouds. The plane touched down just as twilight painted the horizon in hues of deep indigo. The landing was smooth, but for many on board, the weight of what had transpired still lingered like a storm cloud. The passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual rush to disembark strangely subdued. First-class passengers avoided looking directly at Barron Trump, their earlier bravado now tempered by a mix of guilt and humility. Barron, however, remained seated. He watched the line of passengers shuffle past, his expression calm but introspective. He could feel the ripple effects of the incident, even if no one spoke it aloud. His instincts told him that this story was far from over. When it was finally his turn to leave, Barron rose, retrieving his carry-on bag with deliberate ease. His tall frame made him an imposing figure, but his movements were measured, his demeanor composed. He nodded politely to the new flight crew, who stood at the exit, their expressions a mixture of respect and quiet apology. As Barron stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air greeted him, a sharp contrast to the tension-filled cabin. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. It wasn't relief. He had long ago stopped expecting relief in situations like this. It was preparation. Whatever awaited him outside, he was ready to face it. The terminal was quiet at first, the usual hum of activity muted by the late hour, but as Barron emerged from the gate, the scene shifted abruptly. A small crowd had gathered, their murmurs growing louder as they spotted him. Some recognized him immediately, their eyes widening in disbelief. Others were drawn by the palpable energy in the air, their curiosity pulling them closer. Flashes of cameras erupted like distant lightning, their harsh bursts cutting through the subdued lighting of the terminal. Barron's name echoed through the space as reporters jostled for position, their questions overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. "Mr. Trump, can you comment on what happened during the flight? Were you targeted because of your identity? What actions do you plan to take against the airline? Barron kept walking, his long strides purposeful but unhurried. He didn't respond to the questions, his silence a shield against the barrage of inquiries. Behind him, a uniformed security officer tried to manage the growing crowd, his voice firm but largely ineffective. Just beyond the throng of reporters stood a familiar figure, Chief Landry. Her sharp eyes scanned the crowd, her expression resolute. When their eyes met, she gave Barron a slight nod, her posture straightening as if bracing for the inevitable confrontation. "Mr. Trump," she said, stepping forward to intercept him. Her voice was calm, but her tone carried an undercurrent of urgency. "I'd like to apologize again on behalf of the airport and assure you that steps are already being taken to address the situation." Barron stopped, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the noise around them seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the space between them. "Thank you, Chief Landry," he said, his voice steady. "But apologies only mean something if they're followed by action." "They will be," Landry assured him, her tone firm. "The airline has been notified and the incident is being escalated to the highest levels. You have my word." Barron studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good. Because this isn't just about me, it's about how we treat people, whether they're recognized or not." Landry's expression softened slightly, a flicker of respect crossing her face. "Understood." Once outside, Barron was met by a sleek black SUV, its polished surface reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. A uniformed driver opened the door for him, his movements crisp and professional. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Barron leaned back in the seat, the tension of the day finally beginning to settle in his shoulders. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, their glow a stark reminder of the world's unrelenting pace. He retrieved his phone, scrolling through the flurry of notifications that had accumulated. News outlets had already picked up the story, their headlines bold and attention-grabbing. Barron Trump removed from first class, airline faces backlash. Prejudice in the skies, the incident that sparked outrage. Son of the president stands up to discrimination. Barron frowned, his thumb hovering over one particularly sensational headline. He had long grown weary of the media's tendency to sensationalize, to reduce complex moments to simplistic narratives. But this time he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this incident could ignite a conversation that mattered. The phone buzzed in his hand, interrupting his thoughts. The screen lit up with a familiar name. Dad. Barron hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Barron," his father's voice boomed on the other end, laced with a mixture of concern and restrained anger. "I just heard what happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Barron replied, his tone calm. "It's not the first time I've dealt with something like this." "Well, it shouldn't have happened at all," his father said, his voice hardening. "The airline's already hearing from my team. This kind of treatment is unacceptable." "I know," Barron said, leaning his head back against the seat. "But I don't want this to just be about me. It's bigger than that." There was a pause on the line, the weight of Barron's words sinking in. Finally, his father spoke, his tone softer. "You're right, and I'm proud of how you handled yourself. Your mother would be too." Barron smiled faintly, his chest tightening at the mention of his mother. "Thanks, Dad." As the car navigated the winding streets toward its destination, Barron gazed out the window, his mind racing with possibilities. The events of the day had left him drained but resolute. He had seen injustice firsthand, not just in its overt forms, but in the subtler, quieter ways it manifested, in the silence of bystanders, in the complacency of authority. But he had also seen the power of standing firm, of refusing to be diminished. And as the city lights stretched into the distance, Barron made a silent vow to turn this moment into something meaningful, something that could spark change. The storm was far from over, but Barron Trump was ready to face it head-on. The black SUV glided silently through the city streets, its tinted windows shielding Barron from the chaotic world outside. The glow of streetlights flickered across his face, illuminating the quiet determination in his expression. The rhythmic hum of the engine was the only sound, a steady backdrop to his thoughts. The tension of the day clung to him, a heavy cloak that refused to loosen. He was heading not to a hotel, but to a private residence in the heart of the city, a sanctuary arranged by his father's team. The address had been sent to him in an encrypted message shortly after he boarded the plane, a reminder of the careful steps his life often required. But tonight it felt less like security and more like isolation. The walls of privilege, once protective, now seemed confining. The car pulled up to an unmarked gate, its iron bars blending seamlessly into the surrounding architecture. The driver rolled down his window, presenting identification to a stoic guard in a dark suit. A moment later, the gate groaned open, revealing a cobblestone driveway leading to a modern yet unassuming building. Barron stepped out of the car, his long frame unfolding with practiced grace. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. A security team greeted him with quiet efficiency, their movements choreographed and deliberate. One of them, a man in his 50s with a grizzled demeanor, offered a nod of acknowledgement. "Mr. Trump, welcome. Everything's been arranged. Please, follow me." Barron nodded, his words measured. "Thank you, but I'd prefer some time alone." The man hesitated but nodded again, gesturing toward the house. "Of course. If you need anything, we're stationed just outside." Barron entered the house, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The interior was minimalist, the decor a study in subdued elegance. Large windows framed the city skyline, the distant lights twinkling like scattered diamonds. Despite the beauty, the house felt sterile, more a retreat than a home. Barron walked to the living room, his fingers brushing against the cold marble of the fireplace mantel. A stack of neatly arranged books caught his eye, their spines untouched. He pulled one out, a biography of Frederick Douglass, and carried it to the couch. But he didn't open it. Instead, he stared at the coffee table before him, its sleek surface reflecting the faint glow of a nearby lamp. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each moment etched with sharp clarity. The hostility of the crew, the silence of the passengers, the reluctant apologies, and the look in his father's eyes during their video call earlier, anger tempered by pride, frustration laced with love. Barron understood that his father's world was one of decisive action, swift retaliation, and visible power. But Barron had chosen a different path, one his father didn't always understand. For him, power was quieter, more deliberate. It wasn't about proving dominance, but about dismantling systems that allowed prejudice to persist. The stillness was broken by the soft buzz of his phone. Barron glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing slightly at the unfamiliar number. After a brief hesitation, he answered. "Hello?" "Mr. Trump," a woman's voice said, her tone calm but professional. "This is Eleanor Myers, CEO of the airline. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened on your flight today." Barron's grip on the phone tightened slightly. He stood, walking to the large window as he processed her words. "Ms. Myers, I appreciate the call, but an apology doesn't undo the damage." "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "And I agree. That's why I'm calling to inform you that the crew involved has been suspended pending a full investigation. We've also initiated a review of our training protocols to ensure incidents like this don't happen again." Barron let her words settle. He could sense her sincerity, but he also knew how carefully crafted corporate responses could be. "Ms. Myers," he said finally, "this isn't just about the crew's actions. It's about the culture that allowed them to act that way in the first place. If you're serious about change, it needs to go deeper than training." There was a pause on the line, the silence stretching into something almost uncomfortable. "You're absolutely right," she said at last. "And I'd like to invite you to help us with that change. We could use your insight, your perspective." Barron's lips quirked into a faint smile, though his tone remained measured. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." "You are," Eleanor said firmly, "because you've lived it, and because you have the platform to make a real difference." After the call ended, Barron remained by the window, his reflection superimposed over the cityscape. The conversation had planted a seed of possibility, but it also came with a weight of responsibility. He knew that stepping into this role would draw more attention, more scrutiny, but it could also amplify a message that needed to be heard. He glanced down at the book still clutched in his hand. Frederick Douglass, a man who had used his voice to challenge systems, to inspire change, even when the odds were stacked against him. Barron set the book down and returned to the couch, his thoughts racing. The path ahead was uncertain, but he felt a growing resolve. The events of the day had been a catalyst, a moment that demanded action, and Barron Trump was not one to shy away from responsibility, no matter how daunting it seemed. The storm that had begun on the plane was now brewing into something larger, a reckoning that could reach far beyond the skies. The morning arrived quietly, the soft light of dawn casting long shadows through the wide windows of the house. Barron Trump sat at the dining table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He stared into the dark liquid, its faint ripples mirroring the thoughts stirring in his mind. The house was still, the kind of silence that allowed reflection to settle deeply, unencumbered by the usual distractions of his life. He had slept only a few hours, his mind occupied by the implications of the previous day. The airline's offer of collaboration lingered in his thoughts, mingling with the memory of the crew's disdainful expressions and the passengers' silence. There was a bitter symmetry to it all, a microcosm of a larger, more insidious issue. A knock on the front door broke his reverie. Barron glanced toward the entrance, momentarily puzzled. Security had strict instructions to clear all visitors. Rising, he walked to the door, his bare feet quiet against the polished wood floors. When he opened it, he was greeted by one of the guards, holding a small white envelope. "This was delivered by hand, sir," the guard said, his tone professional but curious. Barron took the envelope, noting the absence of any markings. It was unaddressed, save for a single word written in clean, elegant handwriting. "Barron." He thanked the guard and closed the door, returning to the table. Sitting down, he carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief. "Every challenge is an opportunity. Your voice carries weight. Use it wisely. E.M." Barron recognized the initials immediately. Eleanor Myers, the CEO of the airline. He set the note down, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. The gesture was subtle, but it carried weight. Myers was pushing him, forcing him to consider what his role could be, not just as a victim of yesterday's events, but as an active participant in a larger conversation. The following evening, Barron Trump sat in a private conference room high above the city. The room, a sleek space of glass and steel, overlooked a skyline bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Across the table sat Eleanor Myers, the airline's CEO, her expression a careful mix of professionalism and sincerity. Beside her were two senior executives, both looking slightly uneasy. Barron's demeanor was calm, his sharp gaze assessing the people before him. The events of the past 48 hours had brought him here, but this moment wasn't about him. It was about what could be done to ensure that what happened on the plane wouldn't happen again, not just to him, but to anyone. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "Mr. Trump, thank you for meeting with us. I want to start by reiterating my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was unacceptable, and we are committed to making things right." Barron nodded, acknowledging her words, but not letting her off the hook so easily. "Apologies are a start," he said, his voice measured, "but they don't address the root of the problem. This isn't just about one crew or one flight. It's about the culture that allows prejudice and judgment to thrive." Eleanor nodded, her expression earnest. "You're absolutely right. That's why we're initiating an independent review of our policies and training programs. We want to involve experts in bias and discrimination to create a safer and more inclusive environment for all passengers. Barron leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. Good, but I think this goes beyond training. What about accountability? What happens when employees cross the line? How do you ensure that incidents like this have real consequences? Eleanor hesitated, glancing at her executives. One of them, a man in his 50s with greying temples, cleared his throat. We have disciplinary procedures in place, but are they effective? Barron interrupted, his tone firm but calm. Because if they were, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. The man fell silent, and Eleanor spoke up. You're right, Mr. Trump. We need to do more. That's why I'd like to invite you to work with us, not just on revising policies, but on creating a broader initiative, something that can set a new standard for the entire industry. Barron considered her words carefully. If I agree to work with you, he said slowly, it won't be for optics. This can't be a PR stunt. It has to lead to real, measurable change. Of course, Eleanor said, her voice steady. I want this to be meaningful. Barron nodded. Then, here's what I propose. A comprehensive review of hiring practices, a commitment to transparency and how complaints are handled, and a requirement for ongoing training, not just a one-time seminar. And I want input from advocacy groups, not just executives. Eleanor exchanged a glance with her team before nodding. We can do that? And I'd like you to be part of the advisory panel. Barron paused, the weight of her offer settling over him. He wasn't sure he wanted to step into such a public role, but he also knew the power his involvement could bring. Finally, he nodded. I'll consider it. And so, what began as an act of quiet discrimination turned into a powerful moment of reckoning. One man's composure and resolve revealed not only the flaws in a system, but also the potential for meaningful change. This story reminds us that every act of courage, no matter how small, can spark a conversation that matters. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like, share, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll be the first to hear more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power we all hold. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.